Well, I promised you I'd start off today on the interesting subject of sex, and I will keep my promise. So let's first see what the Bible says about this interesting subject, and then what the communists teach about it. As you know, in the Bible, we are told that God made plants and then animals, male and female. And then he made man. I suppose God made angels before he made any of them. But angels, of course, well, either they have no sex, or at any rate they are incapable of sexual intercourse and reproduction. I do believe that, and so I discount one of the theories of interpretation of Genesis chapter 6, that angels attacked women that weren't wearing hats. You've heard that theory? Yeah. That's right, weren't wearing hats, which is why women are to wear hats in worship for the sake of the angels, according to that interpretation. You know, like the angel won't be able to see it's a good-looking woman provided she's wearing a hat, and that way the woman's safe from angelic attack. I'm inclined to discount that because I cannot see that angels have bodies, although of course they can temporarily appropriate a human-looking body. To put it in space-age language, they can look humanoid for a while, but they're not human and incapable of reproduction, indeed of sexual intercourse as I see it. And finally, God makes his highest creature man, higher than an angel, seems to me. A man's a very interesting creature. On the one hand, he's superior to the angel. Unless you're a Roman Catholic, then you believe the angels are superior to men. I don't. Second, man has some similarities with animals and even with plants, which doesn't mean that human beings develop from or evolve from roses. But man does have the many abilities, many unique abilities, and also the ability to engage in sexual intercourse and to reproduce. And incidentally, in a very different way to the manner in which animals and even higher primates, such as apes, do. Very distinct differences between humans, the way they mate, and apes. Well, the Bible says, God said, Genesis 1, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a help meet for him. Well, and as you know, God did. And from the side of the sleeping man, God took a rib and shaped that rib into a gorgeous, beautiful woman. And if you read the Hebrew there, you'll see that the moment Adam opened his eyes and saw this beautiful creature walking toward him, he actually says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she has been taken from the womb of the man. And a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked and were not ashamed." By the way, just for interest's sake, let me say, I do not take the view that Adam and Eve would always have been naked had they never fallen into sin. I can't imagine them staying naked all the time when their descendants had reached Greenland, or even Canada for that matter. It seems to me that that nakedness is said specifically in relation sexual intercourse within marriage. I just say that for interest's sake. Okay, Proverbs chapter 5 has a very interesting statement which I once quoted at a big church meeting where we were debating the acceptability or not of test tube babies. And it says this, "Rejoice with your wife. Let her breasts satisfy you at all times, and be ravished always with your wife's love. But why do you want to be ravished with a strange woman and embrace the bosom of a stranger?" Two things from that. In marriage, perfectly in order, in fact, very proper and pleasant to caress your wife, but it's very improper before marriage to so caress any woman on the face of the earth. That answers the problem of teenage necking, does it not? Okay, what about the words of the Lord Jesus in Matthew? Whosoever looketh upon a woman to lust after her, not whosoever looks on a woman, but whosoever looks upon a woman with the intention of sexually lusting after her, has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Thank God, not in the flesh. And there's a big difference between committing adultery in your heart and committing adultery in the flesh. Obviously, it's far worse to commit adultery in the flesh than it is in the heart, but it is still a transgression of the commandment of God to commit adultery in the heart. Jesus also says, what therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. If God joins two people together, they should stay together and keep coming together sexually, and they should not be pulled apart, neither by themselves through false asceticism, nor in terms of divorce and rematching up to other partners. Whosoever shall get rid of his wife, except it be for fornication. In other words, you try to get rid of your wife unless she has behaved improperly with someone else, and who shall then marry another, commits adultery, keeps on committing adultery. And whosoever marries the woman who has been thus set apart from her husband, he commits adultery. Very unpopular words, those, especially in America. You know what makes me weep every time I come to America, even going into evangelical circles like these, is to find so many decent Christian young people like you. Many of them, I often find most of them from broken homes. Parents that are divorced think, what is happening in America? Anyway, don't let me get on that, except to say it's playing right into the hands of the communists. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, let the husband keep on giving to the wife the due benevolence, that is to say, the sexual intercourse which a husband is required to give to his wife, and the wife to her husband. The wife does not have power over her own body. The feminists say that a woman does have power over her own body. The Bible says she doesn't, particularly if it's a married woman. But the husband does. In other words, it's not for the wife to refuse herself sexually to her husband if she doesn't feel like it. The husband has that prerogative of requiring the wife to give sexual intercourse to the husband, even if the wife doesn't feel like it, and the other way round. And if people really do love one another in marriage, they will want to oblige one another in this way. And let me tell you that if this happens, there'll be very few divorces. But of course, following the Bible way always does minimize divorces. And then Paul says, do not defraud one another. Ever thought of this? A married woman that refuses to give herself sexually to her husband, or rations him, is a thief and a liar. When she married that man, she promised to give herself sexually to that man. Now that she is married, now she holds out on him. That's downright dishonest. And the other way around, too, as far as the husband is concerned. There's a very, very interesting verse, particularly appropriate for young people like you, that I must share with you. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. You must abstain from fornication, which means all sexual activity outside of marriage. Every one of you should know how to gain possession of his vessel, that is, his wife, in sanctification and in honor, not in the lust of concupiscence, so that no man should defraud his brother. Okay, we feel we need to get married. That's great. Now, on your way from where you are now toward marriage, how are you to locate and finally secure that marriage partner? You are not to do it, says the Bible, by way of fornication, by way of sexual activity outside of marriage. And then the very interesting statement, if you do that, you are defrauding your brother. What does that mean? It means you're stealing from someone. You see, a man that seduces a young girl is stealing her virginity from her, and he is also depriving the man that she marries one day of a virgin bride. It's theft and deceit. By this time you're saying, I'm sure, wow, this guy's from the Stone Age, from the other side of the flood, behind the times. That's right. But I'm not just 4,000 years behind the times, I'm 6,000 years behind the times with the Bible and way ahead in the future. And may I tell you, these are sensible ways to live. This is the only way to live. You live any other way, you'll come apart at the seams psychologically. And we don't want that to happen to any one of you. Okay, now how do communists see sex? Marx and Engels say this in the Communist Manifesto. The communists have no need to introduce community of women, that is, men in a tribe regularly cohabiting with women in a tribe. It has existed almost from time immemorial. By the way, there's a great inconsistency there because communist theory says that the first men and women, that the tribe of apes, before they evolved into the first men, were already living in this way. So it wasn't just almost from time immemorial, from a communist perspective. It was even from pre-human times, and therefore from the very first time that there were human beings, until that disease of capitalist individualism destroyed group marriage and led to the Christian family, that abomination which needs to be abolished from the communist perspective. Second, Marx and Engels also say, and this is the most curious statement that I've pondered about a great deal. It's a ridiculous statement, but listen to it, an important statement. Originally, the division of labor was nothing else than the division of labor in the Sex Act. Now, I say that's a very weird statement, not just because of its comicalness, but because communist theory says the division of labor into producer and producee, into owner and manufacturer, only really started when primitive communism degenerated into slavery through economic reasons. But that cannot be so in terms of this other communist statement that I've just read, because if it is so, as stated by Marx and Engels here, that the division of labor was originally nothing else than the division of labor in the Sex Act, well, these first humans that had just ceased to be apes were engaging in the Sex Act, communally, in tribes. So too were the apes from which they had just recently evolved. But if that be so, then the other communist statement is untrue, namely that the division of labor only started after primitive communism, when man degenerated into the state of slavery. You see the incompatibility of these two views? It's very important in debating a communist to zero in on these inconsistencies within communist doctrine itself. It's like taking on a Mormon and showing from the Book of Mormon that the Book of Mormon contradicts itself, as indeed it does in different places. Friedrich Engels was a very immoral man and loved to write about things like sex in a almost lurid way. And in a letter to Karl Marx, he was very peeved because he was suddenly interrupted, had to go off to Germany, I think it was, and soldier a communist insurrection. But that meant he had to drop the work he was doing on a book that he was writing about these sexual matters. And so he wrote to Karl Marx, "Happy and content, I was just in the middle of writing about group marriage when I had to drop everything and go soldiering again." There was an American sociologist, anthropologist called Morgan, about 100 years ago, who did some research among certain tribes of American Indians, Amerindians, Red Indians, and who then turned sociologist and who concluded, quite wrongly, that all American Indian tribes were matriarchal, though of course some of them were, and especially those he had then studied, and further, who from that concluded and went into print saying that originally all human beings all over the world were matriarchal. Well, now Engels picked this up and developed it on the basis of this humanistic American sociologist Morgan's research at that time into a very important book that you may want to read by Friedrich Engels called The Origin of the Family. The Origin of the Family. In that book, Engels says this: "The study of the history of primitive society reveals to us the conditions in which men live in polygamy, one man having several wives, like the Mormons used to have, and their wives simultaneously in polyandry, one woman having many husbands, as was the case, maybe still is, among certain Eskimo tribes." And then he says this: "The next higher plane of society after capitalism," in other words, when capitalism is gone and when the world moves forward through socialism toward world communism, will be a revival in a higher form of the ancient gentes, which means that under future communism there must be a reversion to community of women, community of wives, community of husbands, as indeed the Communist Manifesto itself has stated. And then there is a very important communist thinker, not as well known as he should be, a friend of Marx and Engels, and several times quoted later by Lenin, a man called Bebel, B-E-B-E-L. And he made this statement, which is important because Lenin picks up on it and later quotes it. Bebel said, quote, "The satisfaction of sexual desire is thus just as much a completely personal matter as the satisfaction of every other material desire. If intolerance, alienation, or aversion arises between two people who have entered into an alliance, morality commands that unnatural obligations, which have thereby become immoral, be dissolved," unquote. Now, translated into plain English, that simply means that when the honeymoon is over and your wife cools off and she doesn't want to be cooperative, you ditch her and pick up the first blue-eyed blonde that is cooperative. It's exactly what it means. And Lenin picks that up, and Lenin writes this. By the way, Lenin not only had a wife, he also had a mistress. "You are doubtless acquainted," says Lenin, "with the capitalist theory that in communist society, the satisfaction of the instincts of the craving for love is as simple and unimportant as the drinking of a glass of water. This glass of water theory has driven some of our people, our young people, crazy, quite crazy. It has been the destruction of many young men and women." Now, that's an interesting statement because in Britain, after World War II, the whole sexual customs of Britain rapidly turned on their head. Most women in Britain, until the beginning of World War II, were very prudish, seemed to be very cold. But after World War II and the dislocation which that unleashed, they became extremely many of them extremely licentious, even to the point that British women were an embarrassment to French women. Quite something within one generation. And many of the young people in Britain then, and today too, I guess, took the view that, look, I mean, you know, if you feel a sexual urge, it's just like you feel thirsty. Quench the urge. And many of them live that way. Now, Lenin is here saying that that's not the way to live. So you can have a little bit of sympathy with Lenin there. But then he adds, of course, thirst does cry out to be quenched. So what Lenin is saying is this: be sensible about sex. Don't jump into bed with anyone just when you feel a sexual urge, but try to select the person with whom you satisfy that urge. But then, if they no longer satisfy you after a while, for goodness sake, get rid of them and get someone else. That's exactly what he's saying. Okay, we pass on from the subject of sex to the subject of work. But it's an interesting bridge because of that curious statement I've already mentioned to you, that the first division of labor in work is supposed to be that between man and woman in the Sex Act. Now, when you look at the Christian doctrine of work, very interestingly, it is connected to some extent with sex, and rightly so. Genesis tells us, male and female did God create. God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over everything that moves upon the earth. Now, that is man's work. Of course, men should work even if they never get married. Because whether we eat or drink or work or whatever we do do it all to the glory of God. But when a man does get married and has a wife and children to support, that is an extra incentive to a man to work. And of course, the only kind of woman worth marrying is one who will help a man to work better to the glory of God. And so, we find that when lonely Adam looked at the animals and started giving names to them in the Garden of Eden, he couldn't anywhere find a helpmate suitable for him. But God said, I'm going to make him a helpmate. And as I said to someone quite recently, and as I said to myself before I was married, no man has a right to get married, that is, to start engaging in sexual intercourse, until first he has clarity in his mind about the work that God wants him to do. A man must have a job before he should ever get married. You girls, listen, don't ever marry a man who doesn't know what he wants to do with his life. Not worth marrying. It's unstable. Bad meal ticket. And it's only when a man knows what he wants to do, the kind of work he wants to do, that helps him select the right wife. I mean, for argument's sake, okay, I'm a writer and a professor. Now, the kind of woman I need is one who can type a lot, right? Useless for me to marry some long-nailed beautiful vixen or siren that can't type because of her long nails, no matter how good she may be in other ways. So I believe that the whole essence of marriage is not romantic. I'm anti-romantic. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean I don't enjoy married life. I do. But it means that I deny that marriage is fundamentally a romantic institution. It isn't. It's fundamentally an economic institution where a man that is working for God needs a helper who will help him and encourage him to work for God, and where they will encourage one another pleasurably so that more work gets done by both for God. Or to put it a little more simply, if the romantic view is a man looks into the girl's eyes and the girl looks at the man's life and they say, oh, you're so lovely and you're so pretty, and they just waste hours every day moping and mooning over one another. It's not the way it should be. What they need to do is to look at one another, see Christ in one another, and then both of them look at Christ and determine to serve Christ and encourage one another to serve Christ and help to recharge one another's batteries sexually too, so that both can then perform their work better for Christ. You do that, your marriage will never come apart. But you have this rotten romantic view where you look in one another's eyes till you go all ah-ga, goo-goo. That marriage will not last. 5 years, and then it comes apart. And then you will go through hell on earth psychologically. So it's not worth it. Always smart to follow the Bible. Right down the track. Okay, I'm on work now. And man, God has made man to work. And God made woman to help man to work. And a man is not worth marrying girls unless he knows how to work, and unless he knows what kind of work God wants him to do. Work is important. Ecclesiastes says, I have seen the travail, that means the hard work, which God has given to mankind to be exercised in it. God gives us hard work. The rotten motto, take it easy now, is not found in the Bible anywhere. God has placed the whole world in the hearts of men so that no man can discover the work which God makes from the beginning to the end. Every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all of his labor. It is the gift of God. Again from the book of Ecclesiastes, whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. Be enthusiastic. Not just in romancing, there too, but particularly in your work. Girls, if you're attracted to a fellow, but he doesn't like his work, he doesn't love his work, forget him. Forget him. So whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might, for there is no work in the grave. I think that means once you die and go to heaven, you won't really be working again, certainly not with your body, at least until you get your body back at the time of the resurrection. That's why we've got to work while it is yet day. Every contribution we make to the improvement of this world has got to be made between the time we're conceived and the time we die and hopefully go to heaven. So work, work, work to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians, whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do it all to the glory of God, particularly your work, because man was made to work. And I love also the book of Revelation, 14 verse 13. Blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, said the Spirit, so that they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. What an amazing statement. All the works that you and I are doing on this world now follow us into glory. So you better work good now, because those works are going to come after you into the next life. And of course this leads to the final judgment, doesn't it? Ecclesiastes, God shall bring every work into judgment, whether it be good or whether it be bad. And therefore, 1 Corinthians, always be abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain. Well now, I have to admit that the communists do have a reasonably exalted view of work compared to other false religions, though not as exalted a view of work as has Christianity. Karl Marx said, by work, man becomes himself. Work is the becoming of self. Marx and Engels together said, life involves before everything else, eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy these needs, the production of material life itself. They also say, in communist society, in the future, each can become accomplished in any branch of activity he wishes. And society then makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another thing tomorrow, just as I have a mind. The most crazy statement. He goes on to say, under perfect communism in the future, I'll be able to go hunting in the morning, and I'll be able to go fishing in the afternoon, I'll be able to engage in art criticism in the evening without ever becoming a full-time hunter, a full-time fisherman, a full-time art critic, which is preposterous when you consider the complexity of these various undertakings in the modern world. Anyway, utopian view of work. By the way, I don't know that that would make me very happy. I mean, who wants to fiddle around hunting for a couple of hours and then fishing, and then I'm quite happy dedicating the rest of my life to being a philosopher and to being a theologian. In my own case, there are many things I'm interested in because I've been trained in several areas. But honestly, if I just limit myself to one area alone, and I suppose the area where I'm more engaged in than any other is not philosophy as now, it's theology. I'm a theologian. I'm 55 now. I've written thousands of pages on theology, apart from what I've written on other subjects. I figure I'll live another 15 years, I think in my case 25 years. Expect to live till I'm 80. I don't know I can expect to live beyond that. So I've got 25 years more to write. Look, I've got more theology in my head and my heart now. Take me a lot longer than 25 years to get it all written. And that's why I really am not all that interested in getting involved in things like communism and even law, which I'm both interested in, because they deprive me of precious time, which I should be pouring out in getting all this theology out of my head and onto the paper so that if it's worth anything, the next generation can be enriched by it. So life is awful short, and frankly it is too short to split up your time too much in a variety of activities. Find out the one thing particularly that God has gifted you to do, and go at that hammer and tongs and do it good. And leave behind you, when you leave this life, something that will make people think, you hope, that the world's a better place because of the contribution you made in one major field because you went through that world. So, communism is very unproductive in its doctrine of work when you look at the doctrine of future communism. How does this grab you? Lenin says this: communist labor is labor performed gratis, that means free of charge, for the benefit of society without expectation of reward as the requirement of a healthy organism. In other words, if you're not prepared to work for free, then you're not much of a good worker. Of course, that's ridiculous. Jesus says the laborer is worthy of his hire. I often wonder why I often go on preaching in churches that never even bother to give me an honorarium. I know why I do it. I do it for Christ's sake, because I love preaching. But I don't think it says much for those churches that often expect the laborer to work without payment. After all, if the faucet breaks in my bathroom and the plumber comes around, I don't just thank him, I pay him the bill. And life works that way. And frankly, the Puritan work ethic should work that way too. But you see, many evangelical churches have imbibed principles of communism and turned away from the principles of Christianity as far as that is concerned. Anyway, we work for the Lord, so it doesn't matter too much as far as the labor is concerned. But I feel sorry for the people that ask the laborer to work if they don't ante up when they should. Lenin also says the following, and here's the most intriguing passage: we shall work to do away with the accursed maxim, every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost, the habit of looking upon work merely as a duty, and of considering rightful only that work which is paid for. We shall work to inculcate into people's minds and to turn into a habit and to bring into the day-by-day life of the masses this rule: all for one and one for all. The rule from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. We shall work for the gradual but steady introduction of communist discipline and communist labor. We shall work for years and decades practicing Subotniks. Subotniks was an institution in the Soviet Union in the early 20s. Expected to go work another 5 hours for free. Mao Zedong took the same thing over in China in the early 50s. Practicing Subotniks, developing them, spreading them, and converting them into a habit. We shall achieve the victory of communist labor. I find that one of the most exciting and inspiring statements of Lenin. Of course, it won't work on his premise, but I sure wish Christians could be as enthusiastic about their work as Lenin then was about the work of communists. Okay, let me accelerate. Money. It's interesting that in the Garden of Eden we are told the gold of that land was good. The gold of the land was good. You remember when Abram's wife Sarah died? He bought a cave in which to bury her and paid for the cave with a certain number of shekels of gold current at the merchant. Those were the good old days when coins were solid gold all the way through. I remember when I used to live in the United States about 10 years ago, someone in change gave me an American quarter, but some bright spark had drilled a hole through the quarter, so you could see it was just a thin layer of silvery-looking metal on top, not even silver, but alloy, and on the bottom, and copper in the middle. And frankly, you probably know this, it takes less money to make a U.S. quarter than it does to make a U.S. cent. And the reason is that American cents are worth more money through their copper content than the cent itself, whereas the quarter is only worth about a cent. And governments have gotten real good at this. It's a good way of ripping off your own citizens. And that's the root cause of inflation. But let me not get into that. Inflation, you do understand, is caused by the government, always caused by the government, in issuing more worthless paper money, which is not backed by solid precious metal currency. But the Bible way is not that way. The Bible way is you have the silver, you have the gold, it's precious by weight, you weigh it off at the merchant, and that's what you use to buy the commodities with. If you want to protect yourself in the future, get out of paper money, buy silver, buy gold, especially gold coins and silver coins, and when the Big Bang comes and the day the dollar dies, you'll be able to cash in. Okay, I've said it. Now, Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is like a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered to them his goods. To one of them he gave 5 talents, that means 5 bars of silver. To another 2, to another 1. Then he who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and made another 5 talents. Good capitalist. Well done, faithful servant, says Jesus. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug a hole in the earth and hid his Lord's money. Didn't multiply, didn't increase his wealth. Well, the Lord comes back and says, where's my talent? The fellow who dug a hole in the ground says, well, here it is, just the way you gave it to me. Remember what Jesus says? You wicked servant, you ought to have lent out my money to the money exchangers, so that at my coming I would have received my own plus interest. Take the talent away from this man and give it to the man with the 5 talents who has made it 10. Now that appalls the communist mind. It delights me. It's that mentality that has made the United States great, a capitalist country, until the New Deal. Since the New Deal, we're beginning to spiral downwards. But fortunately, from a very high level. That's why America still has a good standard of living. But America, proportionately, is not in as good shape economically now as it was, several decades ago. And then Jesus says this in Luke chapter 16, make friends with unrighteous mammon. Mammon, it means material things like money and clothes and houses, things like that. Make friends with unrighteous mammon. Notice Jesus does not say unrighteously make friends with mammon, but he does say make friends with unrighteous mammon. If you are a gambler and you want to give me a nice hacienda, which you earned because your horse was good, please give it to me. I promise you I'll look after it. I won't get a house myself that way, but any bad man wants to give me goods that are legally his and he's made them immorally, I'd be happy to receive them. Particularly if you don't want them, pass them on to me. I bump into people in Australia who say, oh, this is bunk about silver and gold. Who wants to hoard silver and gold? I'll say, have you got some silver and gold? Sometimes they say, well, I've got these old pre-1960 Australian dimes, silver dimes. And I say, but you don't think they're worth having? No. I said, well, tell you what. Why don't you sell them to me? I'll pay you twice as much for each one of them as the face value. But you know the strange thing? Very few people at that point are willing to sell to me. They say, hey, there must be something in what this guy's saying. Maybe they are valuable. So if you've got any old U.S. coins, please come see me after this. I'm interested in paying you at least 2.5 to 1 on the face value, without even looking at the condition of your coin. But they must be minted before the early 60s. Otherwise, I don't want them. They're junk coins. They're not worth what's left on them since then. Okay. Jesus says, make friends with the mammon of unrighteousness, so that when you die, they may receive you into the everlasting tents. Don't think you're going to get a big reward in heaven. You'll get to heaven through the blood of Christ, yes, but there's different rewards in heaven. If you've squandered the possessions that God's given you stewardship over now, that will diminish the kind of rewards you'll get, though you will get to heaven, as I read the Bible. Okay, now in communism, the following. Karl Marx said, when we regard goods as wares, we regard them exclusively from the sole perspective of concretized, visibilized, or if you wish, centralized social labor. His friend Engels made this remarkable statement, it is gold and silver which have civilized men and ruined the human race. In other places they say it's the division of labor which ruined the human race. And if it be so that the first division of labor was the sex act, they're going to have to say that sexual intercourse ruined the human race and not gold and silver. So you see how mixed up these people are. Marx said, money is the jealous God of Israel, before whom there may be no other God. Money humiliates all human gods. It changes them into a commodity. Money is the alienated being of man's labor and existence. This foreign being, money, controls man and he worships it. Sometimes that's true, and it shouldn't be. Our aim, said Lenin, is to ensure that every toiler, having finished his 8 hours task and productive labor, should perform state duties further without pay. He also said the Russian Communist Party will strive as speedily as possible to introduce the most radical measures to pave the way for the abolition of money. First and foremost, to replace it by savings bank books, checks, short-term notes entitling the holders to receive goods from the public stores, and so forth. So, money will one day disappear. Lenin has a very amusing statement where he says gold is worthless, which is absurd. He says one day under communism in the future we're going to use gold to make public lavatories from them. But in the meantime we've got to hog all the gold that we can in order to bring about the collapse of the West's economy. Right on the second point. The Christian view of property is, of course, that we either inherit it from our parents, or we acquire it through our own earnings, or we receive it by way of donation from friends that want to give us gifts. Jesus clearly says, "Is it not lawful for me to do what I want with my own? Is your eye evil because I am good?" And he says that in respect of paying the same wage to one laborer who's only worked for 1 hour as he has already paid to another laborer who's worked for 12 hours. In other words, an employer should have the perfect right to pay his employees at different rates for the job. The idea of equal pay for equal work is not the teaching of Scripture. And if it's done on a contract basis, if the employee doesn't want to work on that basis, fine. Let him go work for himself or for some other employer. Organized labor, which I really don't want to get into now, we're nearly run out of time anyway, but the implications are obviously great. In 1 Thessalonians, Paul writes, "This is the will of God, your sanctification, that you study," the meaning there is to work hard, "to do your own business, to conduct your own business, and to work with your own hands, so that you may walk honestly, and so that you should have no lack." He writes in 2 Thessalonians, "Neither did we ever eat any man's bread for nothing, but we worked with our labor and with our travail night and day, so that we might not be chargeable to any of you. For even when we were with you, this is what we commanded you, that if any person did not want to work, neither should he eat." I love this. Particularly living in Australia, where people get an automatic free handout from the state, even if they won't work. I say, with the Bible, starve the brutes. If a fellow refuses to work, starve him. You say, how unchristian. Oh no, how very Christian. That's taken straight from the Bible. By the way, and this is weird, the only constitution of any country anywhere in the world that contains that as part of its constitution, 2 Thessalonians 3 verse 10, is the Constitution of the Soviet Union. "If a man under socialism will not work, starve him to death. He is economically unproductive." Good Christian principle, found only in the Soviet Union today. Of course, that's not communism, you understand. That's socialism. Under communism, everyone loves to work. And having worked, he then simply goes to the state food distribution center and takes whatever he wants. That's the way it works under future communism. Micah says, "Every man shall sit down under his own vine and his own fig tree." Well, now how can that be if every vine and every fig tree in the country has been communally owned? And the book of Revelation says, "To him that overcomes, I will give a new name written, which no man knows excepting him who receives it." I'll better finish on this note in the next minute or two. The communist view of property, Marx and Engels say, "Wife and children are the slaves of the husband." This latent slavery in the family, though still very crude, is the first property. I must tell you that the word husband means housebound. A husband is a poor creature that when he gets married has a chain slapped on him, and his wife's on the other end of the chain. So now that he's chained down by marriage, he can't wander too far from the house. Sure, marriage is slavery, and the husband is the number one slave within the marriage. Okay. Doesn't that make you young men look forward to marriage? Actually, I'll tell you, it's a great form of slavery. It's a great form of slavery. Because although you're shackled on one end of the chain, your beautiful wife is shackled on the other end of the chain. And what God hath chained together, let no man break asunder. Marx and Engels say, "You are horrified at our intention to do away with private property. You reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so. That is exactly what we intend. Engels says, the phrase abolition of private property is the most succinct and characteristic way of formulating the charge in the social order which has been rendered necessary by the development of large-scale industry. The communists are right, therefore, to place this abolition of private property in the very forefront of their demands. Marx says, a whole society, a nation, even all simultaneously existing societies taken all together, are not the owners of the globe, the planet. They are only its possessors, its usufructuaries. Like boni patres familias, they must hand it down to succeeding generations in an improved condition. Last, Lenin says, landed proprietorship is abolished forthwith without any compensation. All damage to confiscated property, which henceforth belongs to the entire people, is proclaimed a grave crime to be punished by the revolutionary courts. Workers' control over the production, storage, purchase, and sale of all materials shall be introduced in all industrial, commercial, banking, agricultural, and other enterprises, and there will be no getting away from it. Well, Lord willing, we'll see you, is it tomorrow or Friday? Friday. And I think in chapel tomorrow for the whole outfit. Is that right?